Hello, as Andrea said, my name is Marc Bayerkohler, and welcome to this panel about scoping. We're lucky to have some experts with us today in our panel discussion. To my left, first we have Tony James with Target. We have Eric Kitchens with Toast, and we have Viviana Wesley with HALOCK. So, to get us started here, why don't we just lay some groundwork? How do you think the different perspectives and definitions of scope kind of cloud our understanding of scope reduction?
That's a great question, Mark. I think from a QSA perspective, if you've worked with me or if you've talked to other QSAs, you've probably heard that scoping is one of the most difficult and one of the most important things that an organization can do when it comes to PCI DSS compliance. However, when organizations talk about scope, sometimes they're coming from a different perspective, right? So sometimes somebody's asking, what's in scope for me? Other times people are asking, what's the scope of the population that I need to be sampling or looking at? Or simply saying, what type of SAQ applies to me? So really understanding that we're talking about scope of the standard, scope of the requirements, and then how you could potentially reduce that scope for an organization becomes really critical here.
In my previous role as a QSA and managing teams of QSAs, and now in my role at Toast, oftentimes I'll talk to customers and that would say, we want to reduce our scope. And I would listen to or have questions from the QSAs that would say, we want to reduce the scope as well. And what they were talking in entirely different language, because merchants and service providers were normally asking about what is the scope of the requirements that I have to validate. And the QSAs were often asking things like, or talking about, what's the scope of the sampled systems? And how much work do I have to do? What is the level of effort going to be on this report on compliance?
Sure. I think ultimately the point there is that you really have to be aligned with your QSA. There's not necessarily going to be one solution that fits everyone. There's not going to be everyone look at the scope exactly the same way. But if you have one perspective and your QSA has a different one, you're definitely going to have challenges. And so getting aligned with them to make sure you know both what you're trying to accomplish with reducing your scope and how you want to get there is key.
To help kind of move that conversation along, and if you ever worked with me, I often talked about capital S scope and lowercase s scope.
Yes, you do?
Capital S scope, I do. Tony knows this a lot. Capital S scope being what your payment channels are. How do you as an entity interact with cardholder data? And lowercase letter scope being everything else, the number of controls that you have to validate or the number of sampled systems.
Well, okay, so now that we have a common language about what scope reduction is, what kinds of techniques have you encountered out in the community?
That's a good question. I think all organizations are aware that they can reduce scope through the potential of using network segmentation, right? Organizations should also consider potentially changing business processes, right? So if the answer to the question, why do we do it this way, is because we've always done it this way, that's probably something we need to revisit, right? Because it's something that could make a significant impact on how that actually reflects to your PCI compliance scope, your cardholder data environment. Then there's also other solutions like P2PE encryption and P2PE validated solutions, which of course is something that organizations will get an automatic scope reduction for, right? If it's a validated solution, they know that they're going to get that scope reduction. The provider is contractually obligated and responsible for the liability. And there's also, the thing to keep in mind with that is a lot of organizations often struggle with finding the right P2PE solution for them because there's not as much flexibility in what you can use when you're using a validated P2PE solution. You might need a different merchant ID, you might need to partner with a different processor, and you might have to replace your equipment itself, which can be very costly. So there's also other options like end-to-end encrypted solutions, but there's some things to understand about those, right? If those are not validated solutions, then the burden for proving that scope reduction is falling back on the merchant. They have to make sure that whatever they're doing for a scope reduction is agreed upon with the acquiring bank or the institution that they are actually submitting paperwork to. The E2E provider would still have that liability shift, but you need to make sure that they also have documentation around what's their responsibility, what's your responsibility, what is that split, making sure that that's very clearly explained. And then you've got organizations like Toast, where you can be a payment facilitator, where you're taking on the responsibility of, I'm a service provider, but I'm also the merchant on record, right? So in situations like that, they are actually responsible for the transactions that are being processed into those merchant IDs. The liability is still with the payment facilitator. And so that can also be a really attractive option for organizations if that is a provider that they're working with.
Yeah, really no one size fits all for any single organization. And it often comes down to what best fits your situation. And if you're going to talk to people at this conference, here in the vendor showcase and as we're meeting each other in the halls, and they're going to say, you have to do it this way. But there's different ways that you can achieve it.
It's absolutely true. It's also important to know that you don't necessarily have to use just one solution. See, you got to take that step back and try to understand, what are you trying to accomplish? Frequently, there's going to be a business reason why you're trying to drive some sort of scope reduction. Are you just trying to save time and money? Are you actually trying to drive something forward, and to do that, you need to reduce that scope? You need to understand what that goal is. And then you can implement perhaps different strategies. You might do an end-to-end encryption solution in one solution if you have multiple environments. You might do point-to-point in one. You might do, like you said earlier, Viv, you might have some network segmentation that might solve your problem in order to achieve that business goal. And that's key, is understand what are you trying to accomplish and pick from any one of these or multiple to achieve that ultimate business goal.
Yep. And sometimes, we use the term scope reduction, but sometimes it might mean scope transference. And something I used to, and some colleagues used to talk about and say, is that it is cardholder data, and it's somebody's responsibility. You just have to understand whose responsibility it is. So maybe scope transference is a way to think of it as well.
Yeah, I like that term a lot, right? Because you're not actually reducing that scope. That scope might be coming out of scope for your organization, but it's still going into scope for somebody. The solution provider, whoever's encrypting or decrypting that information, whoever's taking that responsibility, is still responsible for that security, right? So it's scope reduction, or is it really scope transference? Could be both.
Yep. And what you just said was really the key word, is responsibility for the data. Who is responsible contractually for protecting that data, not just where it lives in a specific environment.
Somebody's always responsible. Right?
Somebody's responsible.
Yeah.
Well, given that, I'm interested to know about some of the solutions that you've encountered and your experiences with those solutions.
Sure, I can take that one. Thanks, Mark. So at Target, we actually started with what many people I'm sure did, is a standard PCI environment, and we transitioned through end-to-end encryption ultimately to get to point-to-point encryption. And it took some time, but again, it was taking that step back to really understand what we were trying to drive. And at Target, we were trying to drive a mobile solution in our stores. And anybody who's tried to have a mobile solution in their stores knows if you have a standard PCI environment, that's really challenging to have a mobile device in scope for all the PCI controls. And for us, then it was important to get all the way to point-to-point encryption for us to be able to leverage mobile devices in stores. And so we worked with our QSA at the time. It may have been someone on the stage to my left who was with a QSA firm at the time, to go through that process to ensure that we were meeting requirements all along the way and maintaining our PCI compliance as we transitioned through to that point-to-point encryption to drive that business solution for us.
Yeah, and when I came to Toast, I had a similar journey that Tony is talking about, but we arrived at a different destination. One of my first roles or first jobs to take care of at Toast was to align Toast's responsibility matrix at the time to the 4.0 standard that was coming about later that year. And as I laid out the new standard and what Toast did and how we did things, I started noticing that there were things that Toast was taking on for our customers that in the past we had said, this is your responsibility, you have to do this, and you have to validate in this way, that because of some of the new applicability notes in requirement 8, that took those point of sale devices really out of scope for them, because those users in our customer base weren't able to affect anything. They were really just a single point of sale user account. They couldn't change any of the ways payment was taken. They couldn't change any of the ways payment was encrypted. And that led us to kind of reclassify what our scope was from being just a service provider and a point of sale vendor to being a payment facilitator, which we already were, but just owning that and taking it on and describing ourselves that way during our next assessment.
I wonder, Viv, as a QSA, how have you seen these approaches work in the community?
So, like I said before, scoping is one of the most important and one of the most difficult things to do, right? So it becomes really, really critical from a QSA perspective, as well as from a merchant service provider perspective. Something that organizations always have to consider is they need to be looking at all of their different credit card acceptance channels. Each channel might actually have a different applicability for scope of requirements, scope of the environment, so each one has to be considered, right? As we've discussed, outsourcing options can significantly reduce that scope, again, really dependent on what solution you're looking at, right? So with validated P2P solutions, we know you receive that SAQ P2PE type scope reduction. With non-validated solutions, we know that the organizations will have to prove that scope reduction to their acquirer or to their financial institution. So one of the things to keep in mind is no matter what, especially as we're transitioning into 4 and 401, that third-party service provider documentation that explains justifications for scope reductions and responsibilities becomes extremely critical. Now, as a QSA, our role should also be to help organizations determine what their scope is, verify that scope, and then talk about, are there risk factors to your scope that you could help reduce over time? One of the things that you both mentioned is that this isn't something that's going to happen in a day, right? So organizations have to have an idea of what their strategy is, long-term and short-term, and what things they can do to impact that over time, right? So it becomes very critical to, again, work with a QSA to fully understand that, find ways to reduce that scope, and again, make sure you all are aligned on your understanding. So when you're going to a validation and you're saying, this is my scope, here's my scope exercise to prove that, there's not disagreement or misalignment there because we're missing something, right?
Sure. I love how you say that about the QSA, the role there in helping the merchant or service provider perhaps work through how they would solve a scope issue. And so if anybody's heard me talk before, I talk about how it is definitely the entity's responsibility to understand and bring forward their scope. But when you talk about something like end-to-end encryption or point-to-point encryption, I can't imagine an entity that's never done it before is going to be that expert. And you need to have a trusted solution provider or a QSA that can help work you through that. And if that's a solution you're looking to implement, if you don't have one of those, I would say find one that can help you work through that because it's important. If you don't have it, you'll definitely struggle with knowing even what questions to ask.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
So what I'm hearing is, it sounds like there isn't just one single solution that really fits everyone. We've got pros and cons for all of them. I wonder, are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I can take that, Mark. So I think the first place to start, I kind of just ended with there is start asking the questions. You might struggle with knowing which questions to ask or even who to ask them of. But if you don't start, you're never going to get there. It took us probably, 6 months to even ask Eric and team the right question to understand what we were trying to accomplish, to try to solve our problems, to even get to know then what type of solution we may want to implement and then eventually get to solve that problem. And if you don't ask those questions now, it'll be another 6 months or a year before you even start that conversation with your QSA. So start now if you're interested and engage right away with what questions you might have to get to that endpoint.
Yep. And I think that really is the key, is that communication. And we're sitting in this order for a reason. Tony asked me a few years ago, and I asked Viv, in this past couple of years, hey, I have this idea, and this is what we're doing. Does this work? Can it work this way? And having that back and forth conversation. And in Toast's situation, we are an end-to-end encrypted solution that we're leveraging as a payment facilitator. And what's really I want you to take away is that just because it's not a fully P2PE, everything is taken care of, it doesn't mean that that's not a worthy way to reduce your scope. It just means you might have more work to do, whether you're the entity or you have to demonstrate that to your customers. But it's a balance, and the graphic kind of demonstrates that the more responsibility that is taken on by your service provider or by your acquirer that's providing a payment solution, that offsets what you have to do. And if there's more things that you have to attest to or have to validate as part of your assessment, that's not the worst thing in the world. Even a little bit helps.
Yeah. And last but not least, right, QSA stands for Qualified Security Assessor, not Auditor, right? So we're supposed to partner with you all to help you understand this, help you find the right way to implement the best controls for your organization based on your business objectives, your technologies, your solutions, and your needs. So please find somebody that you can trust and work with, ask these questions. Everybody can find a way to reduce that scope or transfer that burden if they can't.
Well, that's great. Thank you all so much for sharing. It's been really great listening to your thoughts and experience about all the different options available. I wonder if one of you have like a final message to close us out.
Yeah, I'll be happy to sum that up. I think it's not the easiest thing in the world to do, but you can do it. It just takes the effort, and it's part of your the required scoping exercise that merchants and service providers have to go through. Be clear-headed and honest with what's going on and how you're accepting and interacting with card payments, and then seek the advice of trusted advisors and service providers. And when you're assessing those service providers and those QSAs that you're going to use as that trusted advisor, look for how much work have they done in that space and how involved are they with the SSC, because that makes a big difference. If they are at the table with the SSC and having conversations and part of the TGGs and the other scoping groups and have an understanding, that really helps them be able to better understand what your environment is and be able to apply what the standards are and how they can help you adjust and reduce your scope.
Sounds great. All right, thanks everyone. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.